Good morning, guys. Had a little bit of a family issue this morning that I had to deal with, and so um, I figured I would record this for y'all's viewing pleasure. And what we're going to deal with is we're going to take the Enlightenment, and we are going to see how the Enlightenment goes real world very quickly through the American Revolution, and then the Haitian Revolution, and then later the French Revolution. So we got a lot to discuss, and let's go ahead and get into it. First of all, the Enlightenment is an extension of the scientific revolution. Okay, let's see if we can take some of these scientific principles and apply them to human relations. And the catchword here is for the greater good. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Hobbes, Rousseau, Locke, all these guys, Voltaire, they want to do what's best for all of mankind, all of humankind. And they want to try to make society better for the greatest number of people. And so the Enlightenment ideas began to become extremely popular among the upper class within Europe, and then by extension into the European colonies, especially among the upper class landed gentry, the rich landed people in the 13 colonies. And nobody in the North American English colonies really exemplified the Enlightenment than Thomas Jefferson. He read extensively of enlightened works, and he really absorbed large amounts of these enlightened ideas. Jefferson is a very complicated figure, as all great men are, and he was also a big batch of contradictories. He really believed in the ideas of John Locke, and he was really a John Locke fan, if you want to use a modern phrase. And so he really pulled a lot of enlightened ideas from him. Now, this is the enlightened philosopher who believed in life, liberty, and pursuit of property. And yet Jefferson, one of the larger slaveholders in Virginia, absorbed a lot of these ideas, and again was very silent on the fact that he believed in this idea of liberty and independence of all people. He believed everyone should be independent of all of the people. For example, he believed that working for someone else constituted tyranny. Now, many of you who are listening to this would say, wait a minute, Coach, wasn't Jefferson a big slaveholder? Yes, he was. And this is one of the first elements of Jefferson's contradictory nature. And we don't have time to really go into this being European history. But where this gets into is Jefferson is simply an example of how the upper class in North America really absorbed the ideas of Locke and Rousseau. And going further than that, you have a group of colonists who have become extremely independent of their mother country. And they have seen England as something fairly distant. The English had never really helped the 13 colonists really establish their settlements that much. The English government played really no role at all in the establishment of the 13 colonies. And you get enlightened ideas such as life, liberty, pursuit of property, and also this idea of a social contract where the government agrees to care for the population as the government agrees to care for the population, and the population agrees to follow the government, mixed with this very independent mindset. Then it's only going to take a matter of time before something is going to kind of light a spark under these colonists. Okay. And that spark is going to be the 7 Years' War. And what happens with this war is that England and France are fighting each other again. And Great Britain wins. And Great Britain is in enormous amounts of debt. And they feel that it is right for the colonists to help pay for their defense and to pay for the upkeep of some type of military in the 13 colonies. And so the Parliament begins to impose taxes on their North American colonies, and these taxes have never been imposed before. And there's a long tradition in England of taxes only being taken from you if your representatives consent to it. And this is something that goes back all the way to 1215 in the Middle Ages, when a document called the Magna Carta was signed by King John. And the idea was that only Parliament can take your money away from you through taxes, and only your representatives in Parliament can do that. And the 13 colonies had no representation in Parliament. And so they had a massive issue with the British government coming in and taking money away from them without their consent, even if it was for their own defense. I mean, the colonists had this idea that, okay, all right, you may be here to help us, but you're still taking money away from us without asking our permission. And so you have this English tradition of no taxation without representation in play, at the same time that ideas of life, liberty, and pursuit of property and the social contract, we agree to follow your rules if you agree to rule us justly, start to filter into 13 colonies from North America. And as that's happening, an immigrant to the 13 colonies from England named Thomas Paine writes a document called Common Sense. And it basically says, why should a king 3,000 miles away make decisions for people who have no say in how those decisions are made? And that's what Common Sense goes into. It's a wildly popular pamphlet, and it's written in secret. It's written in it's printed at night, so nobody knows who the printers are, and it's distributed through the 13 colonies. And it really sums up what large numbers of people are thinking. And so these ideas of enlightenment, coupled with traditions of limited government coming out of England, creates an environment in which the 13 colonies simply rebel. They have no, they simply rebel for the British government imposing their will on people that felt like there was no say in how that power of government was going to be imposed. And becoming the spokesman of the 13 colonies is Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson becomes one of the leaders and writes the Declaration of Independence, and it basically is an enlightened document, virtually plagiarizing John Locke. Jefferson starts the Declaration of Independence with a very, very reasoned, logical argument that whenever two groups feel like it's necessary to split apart, then that split needs to happen. And that's how Declaration of Independence starts, that whenever any two groups feel like there needs to be a split, then the split needs to happen. That's the very first few sentences in the Declaration. And then Jefferson goes on to create this very Lockean, reasoned document further by saying that we hold these truths to be self-evident, and all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Now, he switches property to happiness, but to this founding generation, the idea of pursuit of happiness simply meant pursuit of property. And here the British come in to basically take property away from us as 13 colonies without asking our permission. It's patently absurd. And you got this great mix of English tradition with the Enlightenment. And then Jefferson imposes the social contract, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive, it is the right of the people to alter and abolish that government and institute new government. Social contract. When government becomes destructive, it is the right of the population to simply create a new government. And then the bulk of the Declaration of Independence is simply a list of wrongs done by the king. And I would argue that the Declaration of Independence is definitely kind of a amalgamation of different enlightened thinking. Mainly Locke, also with a little bit of Rousseau, with the general will. We feel like that you should not impose your will on us. We have not given our consent to it. You should not draw taxes from us without representation. I mean, that's very Rousseauian. That's Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the idea of the general will. And then Locke, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, meaning pursuit of property. And so the American Revolution, I would definitely argue, is the Enlightenment being kind of applied to a real world situation. Britain has abused us, social contract. We have agreed to live under the king as long as the king did not overstretch his authority. And here the king comes in and imposes taxes through Parliament, in which we had no say. English tradition plus the Enlightenment, written by Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, equals a rebellion in which 13 colonies are able to break away from their mother country. And we don't have time to go into American Revolution. It's not U.S. history. But we end up shocking the world. We, as colonists, defeat the world's greatest superpower. Great Britain was the United States of the day, and we should have lost that war, hands down. But coming to our aid is kind of an unlikely ally, and it's France. Not saying unlikely, but this is an opportunity for the French to get back at the English. I mean, it wasn't for any real love of us. I think that the French aristocracy saw an opportunity to kind of poke Great Britain by helping us, and they succeeded that very, very well. Now France puts a lot of money into this effort, and they put themselves in debt. Hold on that thought for a minute. France puts itself in a lot of debt to help us out. We'll come back to that in a second. Now, inspired by the idea of self-government, we embark on this really unique experiment of self-rule without a king, without a monarch, without an aristocracy. And I think we've done a pretty good job. We wrote a second constitution in 1783, which is the one that we have. And it divides power in three ways. And it really puts the power to govern in the hands of the representatives which we elect. and no one can inherit their title. All of our representatives have to check in with the people, including the president, every 4 years. So I'd argue that even our Constitution is an enlightened document. Now, inspired by our example, the French colony of Saint-Denis rises up against French rule. And this is a unique situation. Saint-Denis was a sugar-producing colony in the Caribbean run by France. And it was mainly a total slave colony. I mean, you had, for every one white Frenchman, you had roughly over 50 to 100 slaves, depending on where you were. And the white colonists were grossly outnumbered. And inspired partly by us and also by the Enlightenment, which had kind of drifted over. The ideas drifted into Haiti, and slaves knew what was going on. And led by a great leader named Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian slaves rise up and run the French out of Saint-Denis and establish a new nation, the second independent republic, Haiti. And so again, we have a second example of the Enlightenment being applied in a real world situation. And Toussaint Louverture is a very interesting character. Runaway slave, self-taught. Taught himself to read French. He lived in the mountains of Haiti with a bunch of other runaway slaves. And communities of runaway slaves were always called Maroons. And they formed a community and a society. And this group of runaway slaves, or Maroons, living in the mountains, they led the revolt. And I would add that Haiti is the only successful slave revolt in the history of mankind, where slaves are able to have total victory over masters. This never happened before, even going back to Romans and Greeks. So it's a pretty good example of people rising up and grabbing freedom. Okay, let's keep going with that. Now, our ally, France, went into a lot of debt to help us out. And I want to talk about that for a second. A French king that we talked about before Christmas, Louis XIV, had established absolute and total rule by the monarch in France. And Louis XIV had created an environment in which the word of the king was law. And all the burdens of governing and decision-making fell upon the shoulders of the king. And that's perfectly fine as long as the king is sound, as long as the king is powerful. And he doesn't necessarily have to make the right decisions, but he has to make decisions and stick with them, and then have the courage to revisit what has gone wrong. And Louis XIV gets in many wars with the Dutch and the Holy Roman Empire, known as Germany, and also with Britain, their old enemy. But through this all, he was able to continue to raise France up as a great power. And he finally passes away after ruling for a very long time. The man lives into his 80s, which was extremely old for that time, even for monarchs. And he's succeeded by, I think, his grandson. He outlives his own son. And Louis XIV is succeeded by Louis XV. And again, adequate king, not nearly as grand as Louis XIV, but Louis XV, he governs well. Nothing spectacular. But when he passes away, and the crown goes to the oldest male, you now have an issue. Because Louis XVI is really not well suited for monarchy. He's a quiet, shy, reserved man who really has a hard time making the hard decisions, and he also has a hard time really enforcing those hard decisions. And Louis XVI would much rather be in one of the rooms of the great palace of Versailles working on clocks and locks and in assembling and disassembling grand clocks and fiddling with them and working on the mechanical operations of giant padlocks. I always look at this guy as being some type of modern computer nerd without computers. He was socially awkward, kind of dumpy. Did not speak well, was not well spoken at all, was not well read either. And even more damaging in France was the fact that Louis XVI was given a absolutely beautiful bride, an Austrian princess and a daughter of the great Maria Theresa, Empress of Austria. And this great empress handed him one of her daughters as his wife. Her name was Marie Antoinette. And Louis XVI just really was awkward around her. And for a French male 200 years ago to be awkward around females was unheard of. It was terrible. It was horrible. You weren't manly. Louis XV had multiple mistresses and all types of illegitimate children. And instead of that hurting him, it actually gave him a sense of greater manhood in upper class French society. And here comes Louis XVI, who it takes the man, along with his wife, of course, over 2 years to conceive a child. And all this time, Louis XVI, dumpy, disheveled Louis XVI, was in the back rooms of the Palace of Versailles working on his locks and clocks. And really incapable of being the absolute ruler that Louis XIV had envisioned France to have. And this monarch couldn't have come at a worse time. France was having a hard time paying its bills. The tax money was not coming in to cover the debts that the French owed. And making it worse, the tax burden of the French nation was on the people least able to pay. The nobles paid nothing. The church paid nothing. The richest people in society paid nothing, zero in taxes. And the poor people of France were burdened with funding the government. On top of that, 5% of the French budget, 5% of the French budget went to the upkeep of the Palace of Versailles and the nobles, who paid no taxes. And to make matters worse, Europe had gone into what we call today a mini ice age. Temperatures had fallen extremely low, and with the lower temperatures, the weather patterns also shifted, and France was hit by unseasonable storms. And over a course of a year, crop after crop after crop in the French countryside had failed or had produced less than what was normal. And as Louis XVI is working on his clocks and locks and not being able to make decisions, France goes into famine. France, one of the greatest agricultural societies in Europe, goes into famine. And the French government couldn't pay his bills. And you need strong leadership at this point. You need somebody to take things in hand. And Louis the 16th was unable to do that. Really was. Now, let's take it a step further. Louis the 16th brings in 3 financial experts. And each one, in turn, says, Your Majesty, you must tax. You must find new sources of revenue, and we recommend you taxing the nobles in order to pay down this enormous debt that you've run up. And every time he says, yes, I'll do that. And then when the nobles push back, he gives in. Food begins to run short, and as food runs short, the prices of food goes up, which triggers enormous amounts of inflation throughout France. The French people see prices for all products rise and rise and rise and rise. And these people are poor to begin with, and they can't afford to live. And as all this is going on, Marie Antoinette is throwing elaborate dinner parties. And each woman that goes to these dinner parties have hairdos that take hours to create. And the image of Marie Antoinette, you can look up these really horrible cartoons on your own that the French drew about her. The image of Marie Antoinette throwing these massive dinner parties as the French people starve doesn't play well with the people of France. It also doesn't help that she is a German from the Habsburg family who rules Austria. And it must be her fault. She is influencing the king and helping him make bad decisions. It must be the king's advisors. It certainly cannot be the king. And Louis continues to waffle and make ill decisions, or no decisions at all, which is even worse. And finally, Louis XVI, faced with riots and a worthless currency and no way to pay the bills, he calls in the French Parliament. The French Parliament had not been called in over 100 years. Louis XIV had not used it. He was an absolute monarch. And Louis XVI now calls in the French Parliament the Estates General. And they hadn't been in the Estates General in anybody's lifetime. And the French Parliament, the Estates General, was divided up into 3 parts. The first estate, which was the church. The second estate, which were the nobles. And the third estate, which was everyone else. And representatives from these 3 estates met around Versailles, the great palace of the king. And for anything to get done in the Estates General, the 3 estates, the church, first estate, noble, second estate, and everyone else, all 3 estates had to agree on legislation. And the common people, over and over and over again, keep getting their ideas voted down. The common people, the third estate, would like taxation on the nobles. They would like a restriction on how much money the king can spend. They would like to see everybody pay their fair share for the upkeep of France. They would like the Estates General to meet on a regular basis, and they would also like the third and first estate the first and second estate to quit blocking what everybody else wanted. And finally, frustrated and exasperated, the members of the third estate, the common people, their representatives, march out of the Estates General and discuss to a tennis court right near where they're meeting. And they take a tennis court oath to not leave Paris until France is changed. As that is occurring, the people of France, the people of Paris, begin to get enough of the king. A mob of women from the fish market, tired of rising bread costs and food prices and rising prices of all things, march on Versailles. And these were called the fishwomen. And they were big, strong, husky females who were used to chopping up fish with knives. And they march on Versailles. And to the horror of the king, they push past the guards, murdering many of them, push into the palace, and they are running through the palace looking for the Austrian princess, the German Marie Antoinette, to kill her. And Marie Antoinette escapes the fishwomen by that much. She goes into a secret passage next to her bedroom and runs for her life along with her kids. And the king then finds his wife, and she's terrified. The king actually makes a very smart decision. He goes out into the balcony so that all of the rioters, all of the fishwomen could see him. And they're at awe with the king. And then the king does something very unexpected. He goes downstairs and goes into the middle of them, him, his children, and Marie Antoinette. He tells them, "You are my people. You are my subject. I put the most precious thing to me, my children, in your hands." And the fishwomen are absolutely stunned that the king would do this. And the king agrees to go back to Paris and not stay at the Palace of Versailles, but stay in the heart of Paris, the beating heart of France. And as that's occurring, the Third Estate has taken a tennis court oath not to leave. And the Third Estate begins to refer itself as the National Assembly. And they start making laws, and the king begins to sign off on those laws. And it's beautiful. You see the beginnings of a constitutional monarchy in France. You see the beginnings of a true representative government in France, with the king being a limited monarch and almost like a chief executive. And then when that was beginning to develop, you see the king begin to call in the army, and the people of France become very, very frightened. Or people of Paris become very frightened. And you have then more riots in Paris, and you have the storming of the Great Bastille by the common people of France. And this is a place traditionally holding political prisoners, people who've simply spoken out against the king. And this great prison is also rumored to have weapons. And as the king had called in the military just to be on the safe side in case trouble happens, these people ensure that trouble does happen. And the king gets extremely nervous. And the common people of Paris now have control of the Bastille. And fighting begins to take place in the streets of Paris. And that's where we'll leave it for this morning. I'm sorry I wasn't able to meet with you this morning, but I hope this helps. So think about this. The Enlightenment is first applied in the American Revolution, and then is applied secondly in Haiti, where the slaves rise up under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture. And then in France, the people begin to take control and take things in hand. And the king is marched from his Palace of Versailles to the heart of Paris. And you begin to have beginnings of a representative government in which the Third Estate of the Estates General has left the Estates General and declared itself the National Assembly, the representatives of the people. And they begin to make changes. And when I see you next week, we'll talk about those changes, and we'll also talk about how the French Revolution turns and how it turns into something from being something beautiful to being something ugly. And we will see how the French Revolution also in the next couple of days goes full circle, and we will compare it with the American Revolution. So again, guys, sorry for not being there, but I think you'll appreciate that I'm cutting y'all loose a little bit early. So thank you very much. Take care.